what is a revenue rhythm? Like, define it for us.
Any training that you would like to roll out to your team, you are praying and hoping that they remember this stuff. And the vast majority of the time, people in sales especially do not learn by sitting and listening. They learn by doing. And so the 30-minute training or the 60-minute training must be followed up with what I call a revenue rhythm, which is an ongoing 15 to 30-minute bit anywhere between once a week or every other week or sometimes monthly to reinforce the concepts and really make the concepts of that 30, 60-minute training stick.
Your sales team is a driving force behind your revenue growth. But if every rep's sales cycle is a reinvention of the wheel, you're losing both time and revenue to revenue leak. As a revenue leader, it's your job to make sure that they have the tools and processes to close deals effectively. But how do you ensure that every opportunity gets the attention and nurturing it deserves, regardless of the size of your team? Today's guest is an expert in creating the rhythms and cadences that a growing sales team needs to be successful. You probably know him as the founder and host of the podcast, 30 Minutes to President's Club. Armand Farrokh was also, until the beginning of this year, the VP of Sales at Pave. He started as employee number 9 and the first sales leadership hire, and built the team from 2 to over 30 in under 2 years. Prior to his time at Pave, he was a massively successful account exec, then sales development manager at Carta, where he built multiple successful SDR teams. Armand has a wealth of knowledge around taking small sales teams and scaling them quickly and effectively. Make sure to stick around for his advice to VPs on how to stay forward-looking in the role.
I'm Kyle Coleman, sales pro turned SVP of marketing at Clary. Run Revenue is the show where revenue pros learn to stop revenue leak, achieve revenue precision, and grow their companies and careers.
This is Run Revenue Show with Kyle Coleman.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Run Revenue Show. I am joined today by my dear friend, Armand Farrokh. How you doing, Armand?
I'm doing fantastic. And oh my God, what a reversal of roles. You are episode 5 on 30 MPC, and I never thought I would be able to sit in the guest seat across my good friend, Kyle Coleman. And so here we are today. I'm doing great.
It's very exciting, Armand. And I know you have an awesome perspective on the main topic of what we're talking about today, which is defining and scaling revenue rhythms. But before we jump into that, for people who have been living under a rock and don't know who you are, give us the 2-minute version of your career arc. Where you been? What are you doing now?
Alrighty. So started my career actually way back in college. First exposure to selling was selling insurance, making 200 cold calls a week. And then from there, a delightful life. And that's actually where I heard the name tossed around opener. My favorite cold call opener came from. And then from there, I actually decided to get out of that, worked in finance, worked in venture capital for a minute. But really my first formal SaaS sales gig was at a company called Carta. So I started as an AE, and I became the number 1 AE in about 6 months, largely through my ability to prospect and negotiate really well. And they said, take what you're doing, multiply it across 30 SDRs. So I took over the whole SDR org, did that for another 9 months. And then they said, hey, this is working pretty well. Take over SMB sales too. And so by the time that I left, which was about 2 to 3 years in, I was running a team of 30 or 40. And that was a blast. But I've always had the itch to go to a smaller company. And so I joined a company called Pave as employee number 9. And so I was the first sales leadership hire, second sales hire overall. And from 9 employees went to about 200 employees, went from about 150K of ARR when I joined pre-product market fit to left around over 10 million bucks in ARR.
Wow.
And saw the company through product market fit to first sales hires to first sales leadership hires and beyond. And then on top of that, many of you may know me from the podcast that I run, amongst other things with webinars and newsletter and whatnot, through 30 Minutes to President's Club, which is what I do full-time today.
Beautiful. Okay. So you've been at companies with decent scale, and I think you said about 250 sellers at Carta. You've been at super small companies with no manual, no playbook, no nothing. And so this concept that you and I have talked about before, Armand, of revenue rhythms is something that you take very seriously. You've seen revenue rhythms in practice. You've created them from scratch. Before we dive into how you've approached this, what is a revenue rhythm? Like, define it for us.
All right. So what is a revenue rhythm? So if we take a quick step back, any concept or any training that you would like to roll out to your team is a prayer to the heavens. And that prayer to the heavens is, I hope, in that 30 to 60 minute enablement training where half of your team is falling asleep or half of your team is multitasking on Slack because half of the team is remote, right? You are praying and hoping that they remember this stuff. And the vast majority of the time, people in sales especially do not learn by sitting and listening. They learn by doing. And so the 30-minute training or the 60-minute training must be followed up with what I call a revenue rhythm, which is an ongoing 15 to 30-minute bit anywhere between once a week or every other week or sometimes monthly to reinforce the concepts and really make the concepts of that 30, 60-minute training stick. And it allows you to keep track and chip away at these things every single week. So the foundations and the principles of that training never slip too far. And that leads to you doing things like not missing your forecast, having more predictable revenue, and having your sellers all have certain things in common that they're able to do in their sales cycles.
Wonderful. So give us an example of that type of rhythm that you establish, put into place, and use to reinforce a process either at Carta or at Pave.
100%. So one of the challenges that we were dealing with is as you go from 2 reps to 10 reps, that's right when you start to, 1, bring on your first sales manager, and then 2, you can't see every single deal anymore. And so what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to identify the anchor points in a deal and very quickly drill down to the key anchor points in a deal for your most critical deals across the sales organization. So let's start with the training and then let's go through the rhythm. The first thing that we did is because we now had 10 people who may not have seen the product grow up from 0 lines of code like I had, is we had to identify what we called the golden path for a deal. In other words, what are the key stages a deal needed to go through? And then what is the rhythm that enforced that golden path? Is there are a couple of different ones specifically for the golden path, but one of my favorite ones was a top 10 deal review, which is the entire AE team would be invited in as the forum, and we would go over our top 10 deals, typically key deals over $50,000 at the time. And each of them would basically go through a public pipeline review of the golden path with the team. And it did get intense, but it was meant to be a fun thing. And it was not meant to be an Armand grills you in front of the whole team. It was meant to be everyone on the team is asking you questions to cover your blind spot. And that 1, educated people on what the golden path was, 2, made it stick, but then 3, also enforced it on our key deals.
That kind of collaboration between sellers is so powerful. There's this notion, I think, that a lot of sellers have, or that people have of sales, that it's a lone wolf exercise, that salespeople work alone. And that just could not be further from the truth. All of the most successful sellers that I know, all the people that are going to President's Club year after year, without exception, are the most collaborative people, are the people that want to work in public, that want to get input from their peers, fellow sellers, SDRs, SEs, executives, product people, whatever it is. They know how to work with the people around them to strengthen their deals. Is that the type of forum that you were hoping to create there?
It's exactly right. So I was a high school and college wrestler, which is where I met my co-host, Nick Skalski. And wrestling I see as very, very similar to sales in a lot of way because it's an individual sport. It's a one-on-one match. Each seller has their own quota, but you practice as a team. You cannot wrestle yourself. It looks a little bit weird if you do that. And so the exact same thing is with selling is, look, if the only thing you're doing is you're taking stuff from an enablement session, or you might be taking stuff from your manager, the beauty about sales is it's also a little bit like the coolest video game in the world, where you can have 10 different fighters in Street Fighter. You can have 10 different styles of sellers, and all 10 of them can work. And your job is to go absorb that from the other 9 sellers on your team and build your unique style. So people will be like, where did you get your style of selling? And my answer is I got it from 50 different people, and I took 3 things from 50 different people.
Yes. Okay. So on that point of all the things that you could potentially do to navigate a deal, the choices are endless, Armand. You could, get as granular as you possibly could and be super prescriptive about, quote unquote, the right way to run a deal, or as you called it, the golden path. How do you find the right balance between prescription and autonomy to make sure that people can still work a deal to suit their strengths while still making sure that they're adhering to the golden path and the revenue rhythms that you've built?
That's right. So let's talk about the stages, and then let's talk about how we steer through the stages as an example. Okay. So when we talk about the stages of the golden path, the main thing that we identified are the people that need to be involved at each stage and the exit criteria of each stage. How you get to that exit criteria is where your style comes in. So for example, a lot of people, I think, overcomplicate their Salesforce stages. I don't have all these crazy names for these Salesforce stages. I had a couple really, really simple ones. First, it was discovery. Second, it was demo. Third, it was multi-threading. Fourth, proposal and negotiation. Fifth, vendor review. Sixth, close one. Those are the basic steps a deal goes through. And then what we would do is we would just identify exit criteria for each of those stages. So for example, discovery, the exit criteria is your champion believes you can solve a problem for them, or they've agreed to a problem. Exit criteria for stage number 2, which would be demo, is champion believes that you specifically, your solution can solve their problem now that they've seen it. Exit criteria number 3 for multi-threading stage might be power agrees that you can solve their problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we've aligned on the exit criteria. And then what we do to navigate those stages is we mainly focus on 3 areas of a discovery call that whether you're a red, blue, or green, whether you want to run your sales calls with really high energy or really low energy, there are 3 things that every Pave seller should be able to do in a sales call. And those 3 were, number 1, you can set an agenda that anchors to an outcome. Number 2, we had a couple of basic business impacts that Pave could hit on, and you had to get to 1 or 2 of them. And how you got there is the art of selling, but you got to get to something like, I'm losing people, I'm losing candidates. And then number 3, we called it the 5-minute drill, is there were 2 or 3 things that you always wanted to make sure that you got at the end of every call to figure out if you were wasting your time or not. And everything else is just you as a seller figuring out your unique style of navigating those stages.
Interesting. And now how do you reinforce that stage criteria or that standardization of those outcomes with the rhythms that you put into place?
That's right. And so we talked about the exit criteria for each stage. That gets reinforced at multiple layers of the organization. So for example, the top 10 deals are one public forum for that. And what we trained our team to do is because everyone knew the exit criteria, they could summarize a deal. It was mandatory with me that you were able to summarize a deal in under 60 seconds. And the way that you would summarize a deal in under 60 seconds is you would just say how you checked off each exit criteria in each stage. And then if you had a next stage coming up that you hadn't checked off, you would just say, this is what I need to do to achieve this exit criteria. And that is where the questions would begin. And so that was the basic questioning flow and our standardized language around how we talk through a deal. And all we did is we just carried that language through different rhythms. So for example, that is also the shared language that we use in pipeline reviews. The only difference is we're not doing top 10 reviews. We're doing your manager is reviewing 10 of your deals, right? If we're doing a forecast, and I want to know about the commit deals, and I want to poke in on 2 or 3 of them, I'm going to ask for that same 1 sentence or that 1 sentence per exit criteria summary. And so it happens at the rep level when you think about pipeline reviews. It happened at the team level with top 10 deal reviews, and then it happened at the org level with a forecast as well.
So you have rhythms defined for different stakeholders who have different positions in the hierarchy across the company. So it sounds like what you have done, or what these rhythms end up creating, this set of cascading rhythms ends up creating, is ultimate visibility and transparency.
Totally.
Whether you're the CEO of the company, the CRO, VP of sales, individual rep, maybe even a board member. Is that how you think about the main virtue of these, Armand, is the visibility, the transparency, and then ultimately the predictability?
Exactly. It's the upward and outward. It is the visibility and ease of understanding where a deal is at. one of the most challenging things when you're first doing pipeline reviews, and a lot of orgs where I've seen them do pipeline reviews or forecasting, is they haven't aligned on a shared language for how to talk about a deal. So it takes them 20 minutes to get through a deal. And every week it's the same, all these ancillary details around, oh, I sent him this email and the call went well, but this person was grimacing and it looks sort of odd. All you're doing is you're cutting out all the garbage to the essence of what it takes to get your sales cycle done. And you're using that as the mechanism to tee up questions of, do we believe that the exit criteria in the next stage will be achieved? So that's what happens upwards. But what also happens downwards with your sales team, downwards doesn't sound right, but you know what I mean, is with the reps, sure, right? What they're able to do is, because you simplify it, they can orient themselves in a sales cycle, and anywhere they are, because they've done this weekly deal review, because they've heard 7 other sellers do it every single week for the last 12 weeks, no matter where they are in a deal, they can orient themselves as to what the next steps are in a deal.
It's amazing. So put a little bit differently, you have architected, or you're suggesting ways to architect how leaders and reps and anybody up and down the organization can identify areas of revenue leak that exist across their revenue process, and then stop that leak, reverse the leakage, shore up and strengthen deals by ensuring that you're inspecting the right things at the right time, that you have a shared language up and down and across the business, and that reps, leaders, executives, and everybody in between knows what their contribution is collaboratively to help make sure that that deal can get in and close. And having that cadence, having those rhythms set up is a way to make sure that all of these different things can come together and complete the full puzzle.
That's exactly right. And there's one thing that I want to talk about that you hit on there is, again, it's sort of like this sonar within your organization, right? You ever see a sonar? It's just constantly bleep, bleep, bleep. It's constantly scanning the environment, right? And if there's something that seems off, you get a bleep, right? And so in these one sentence deal reviews, the other things that you can start to listen to in the shared language is, if someone says, I cleared stage 1, my champion agreed that there's a problem. You might ask them, what was the problem they agreed to? They might say, they really like Pave. And I go, oh, hold on, that's not a problem. And now we need to go back, and my sonar, because we have a standardized language and standardized exit criteria that we ask about, right? I'm going to go back over that sonar blip. And it was easy for me to find it because, again, we've done this a million times every single week.
Love this. So take us back now to your early days at Pave. You mentioned you were the 9th employee. You were the first sales hire. There's no manual. There's no process to speak of. You were creating everything from scratch. Many of the listeners of this show are in a position very similar to yours, where they're building something from nothing. How did you decide where to start, and where did you start?
So when I joined Pave, it was small, like 150K in ARR. I think it was closer to 100. And many of these customers, Kyle, were paying like $500 or like $1,000, or it was this random company that was completely non-ICP, and the product was a dream. And the reality is, if you've ever joined an early stage organization, you might have a CEO who's an amazing salesperson. And that may be true. However, a CEO and a founder can do things that no sales rep is able to do, because people will be like, I want to bet on this founder. But the unfortunate reality is, Kyle, people don't want to bet on people like you and I, because we are sellers, right? And it's not our baby, right? They still do, because I was an early stage employee, but it's a little bit different, okay? So the way that I would describe the key arcs that I undertook when I was at Pave, the first arc was massively fill the funnel, because inbound was drying up. It was the wrong types of leads. It was non-ICP companies. Pave was a compensation planning tool, and 50 employee demo requests did almost nothing for Pave, because companies aren't thinking about compensation when they're 50 employees. So the first piece is, let's get a lot more of the right types of deals. But then the second piece, which was frankly the most important piece, is we had to use sales as a mechanism to force Pave into product market fit, because I joined pre-product market fit. And so it was my job to identify who were the customers where we had 10% of the vision right, and they were willing to take a risk on us so that we could take that 10% to 20%, and that 20% to 30%, and that 30% to 40%, and we could sign the right customers who would pull us in the right direction.
That's right. Design partners.
Exactly right. So that when we finally found someone who had the sweet spot 2 years later, it wasn't like we were 10% of the way there. We were 120% of the way there because there are other customers that taught us what the problems in the market were.
To summarize, early on, you're focused on defining the ICP, ensuring that everybody understands what the ICP is, that you're creating the outbound mechanisms to go out and proactively target those ideal customer profile companies, the folks that match. And then you're also finding the right ways to work with people and other companies to help create the product and make sure that the problems that you're solving, the way that I think about it, Armand, for early stage companies is not product market fit, it's problem market fit. We want to make sure that we understand the problem well enough to design the product to go and solve it for as many of these customers as we can. And that was your early motion. You also design motions around, this word kind of sounds like a negative connotation, isn't profiling, building your profiles for your first sales leadership hires. Talk to us about how you did that.
Yeah, so first sales leadership hires, right? Or first reps even. All right, so let's talk about two types of molds. A lot of founders that I now do some advisory work for largely series seed and A stage companies. And a lot of founders, they really, really mess up the first sales hire and the first sales leadership hire. Let's start with the first sales hire. Rep number 1 is going to look radically different from rep number 100. And you have to be comfortable with that. Rep number 1 might not succeed as rep number 100. Rep number 100 will probably not succeed as rep number 1. Okay. The things you are looking for in rep number 100 or 1000 is the ability to navigate an enterprise deal process, the ability to forecast, the ability to leverage SEs, the ability to have a platform sale where you can quarterback a deal. None of that stuff exists. Unfortunately, you're the quarterback and the wide receiver and the running back and all of these other things. And so the first thing that you're looking for in that early sales hire, number 1, is do you have the propensity to build? In other words, do you have the mindset of, I don't just crank the wheel, I crank the wheel 3 notches, and if it gets stuck, I go back and I crank the wheel in a slightly different direction or in a slightly different direction. And there are a variety of ways I'm happy to talk about that you can test for those things, right? That's number 1. Number 2 is you might be able to operate on 30% outbound, 20% outbound if you are the 100th rep or even the 50th or the 10th rep, right? Killian was the first sales hire, I was the second. Killian and I would be like, today is going to be Sequoia Capital Day. And we would cut the Sequoia portfolio in half and we would be like on both sides. You take half, yep. I take half, we're going at them. And we would book 8 meetings a week each because there was nothing coming in because no one even knew who we were. So that's number 2. And then number 3, which is probably one of the most important ones, is you're really, really, really looking for someone who has that intellectual curiosity and discovery to not just look for the problem we solve, but to look for problems that pull you in the right direction of product market fit, because you might not be solving the right problems today. So early stage selling is discovery at its essence, because you can't do demos half the time because the product doesn't even exist in its fullest form. We went super, super, super deep in things like discovery. So I'll pause there.
That's awesome, Armand. Something that I think is really useful is you talked a lot about the revenue rhythms to assess the strength of deals, but I know you also apply the same prism to assessing the strength of your sales leaders or your sellers. So how do you create a rhythm around assessing their fit? Are they doing the right things? Are they performing the tasks that we need them to perform at the right times? Are they fitting the mold that we thought we hired them for? How do you introduce a better rhythm to that so that it's not a problem that a CEO or a founder lets fester and then a quarter goes by and then a year goes by and they're stuck with the same sales leader who's just not doing the right stuff?
100%. So we talked largely about process rhythms before, right? But I think of sales in a couple of different phases. The first phase is prospecting. The second phase is discovery. And then the third is process, right? Negotiation, driving a deal through stages, right? And we have rhythms in place for prospecting and discovery in addition to process, right? And by the way, this was under 4 hours of meetings per week. And so these are really, really tight, high leverage meetings. Those rhythms exist both in the hiring process to vet people out and also as people come full time in our coaching process. So let's start with prospecting. Okay. The prospecting rhythms as we hire someone is I don't believe in behavioral interviews more than a couple of times. Okay. I think it's really, really, really easy to fake answers. I think you can give 70% answers in behavioral, and because you cannot see, hear, or touch the answer, it can slide by. And so we would always include some prospecting doing exercise in our interviews where we would say like, okay, here's your territory of 10 accounts. Tell me how you're going to break into these 10. Or, hey, we're writing cold emails, write a 3-step drip to this prospect and figure out which of the 3 or 4 contacts would be best to reach out to. So we're making them do those things in the interview process. And then as they join the company, typically our Monday morning meeting was the mechanism to reinforce prospecting rhythms, right? So the Monday morning meeting was always a leading indicator meeting where we would start by reps of the week, and reps of the week were always shouted out based on prospecting leading indicators, dials, emails, certain conversion metrics, pipeline generated, et cetera, right? And then we would always end it with something that was called a 5-minute squeeze, which would be a 5-minute breakdown of one topic, whether it's a cold email, a cold call, or what have you. And we would take a rep who was rep of the week and be like, it's your turn to do the 5-minute squeeze. And so again, we're chipping away at this prospecting accountability and training every step of the way. And you can start to see when things go off.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we've talked about process building at a smaller company. We've talked about making sure that you have different levels of abstraction up and down the hierarchy so that there's a shared language that everybody understands. We've talked about rhythms for evaluating talent for hiring and then for continued performance management. Now, talk to us a bit more about your experience at Carta, Armand. How have you seen larger organizations successfully implement this type of rigor around the rhythms without overwhelming everybody with a billion different meetings and people start, losing interest because the meetings become not useful? So how do you scale this while keeping it useful to everybody involved?
100%. So the first thing that happens is when you get to the org the size of 250, for example, you cannot have 249 people inside of a deal review and one person's deal being reviewed. It's not useful anymore. I've seen it happen. It's weird. No one wants to participate. So the first thing that you do is, Kyle, I hate to use this as a cop-out answer, but essentially what we're doing is we're just scaling those rhythms that you heard at Pave. We're scaling those down to the manager level. So every manager is running their own mini Pave sales org, right? So the deal reviews might happen at the director level for the top 10 enterprise deals in the enterprise segment, right? And then the managers might be running their own Monday morning meetings with their own reps of the week, right? And we would do other things like discovery tape reviews and whatnot. And what you do is you have those rhythms occur at the team level so that they stay fresh because people can feel like they can participate. And it's also a small enough group that you can rotate the tapes and everyone gets their own fair share of frequent enough bats. And so that's what happens at the bottom, sort of as you start to scale these rhythms down in the organization. And then the key thing, Kyle, that I also want to call out is you want to avoid meeting bonanza. And so rhythms are a mechanism to have a standing meeting in place to achieve a specific purpose, whether it's making sure that we stay accountable on prospecting, making sure we stay sharp on discovery. And I was a hawk if someone ever scheduled a team meeting that was not in one of those rhythms, because 9 times out of 10, it should have been folded into one of our rhythms. So if someone wanted to do a product training or something like that, if it took under 15 minutes, do it in the Monday morning meeting when we're doing announcements, right? If you wanted to run a discovery session, do the 15 to 30 minute primer in the Monday morning meeting. Let's review it in our tape reviews, right? And so you use the Monday morning meeting to infuse new concepts into your team. And then you use the other rhythms to enforce the concepts so those rhythms constantly grow, evolve, and change.
You're using this word rhythm very intentionally, Armand. And what I'm hearing from you now is that the purpose of the rhythm is predictability for the people who are participating in the rhythm. They need to know what is going to happen and when so that they can design their week to do all the other things that they need to do which are not going to be in those team meeting times. So talk to us a little bit about like, what does a month look like? You've mentioned this Monday morning meeting. You have forecast calls, I'm sure, every week, but what other kind of revenue moments do you have across the monthly rhythm?
Definitely. So let's start at the org-wide level, and then we can talk about cascading rhythms upward, right? So, and we talked about the infusion of content, right? The infusion of new learnings, new trainings, what have you. And those are what get infused into the rest of the rhythms. So typically once per month, I'd like to do it on a Friday over lunch. Once per month on Fridays, we would do one big team training, right? And it would be something that we put a lot of effort into, where we're like, hey, we're getting our butts kicked on negotiation, or hey, we're dropping deals at this point in the sales cycle. Let's go deep on this one thing and make it as interactive as possible. That would happen once per month. Then if we just walk through the week-to-week cadence, where are the different places that could get reinforced? So on Mondays, we had the Monday morning meetings, which is the leading indicator meeting that I already talked about. On Tuesdays, we would typically do the mid-market enterprise top 10 deal reviews. And that was a weekly thing because, again, those weeks we wanted to stay on top of those deals every single week because they're constantly changing and things are constantly happening. If you do that every month, it's too infrequent. Wednesdays and Thursdays, it was typically pipeline reviews between the reps and the managers. And then on Fridays, for any other week where it wasn't a training, we would do two things. One, we would oftentimes do a Friday tape review over a fun Friday lunch, right? And so we would watch some discovery tapes, or we'd watch a negotiation tape if that's where the team was struggling, right? And then we would typically end the week with a forecast call that would take us into the next week. That's really the all hands level. From there, you have multiple layers of forecasts that I'm happy to go into if helpful. Is you have the forecast at the manager level, so team by team. And then you have the forecast at the segment level. And then you have the forecast at the CEO level and the board level and so on.
That's wonderful. And I'm curious, Armand, if you ever got to the point where you're not just doing in-quarter forecasting, but also you start to do out-quarter forecasting or maybe pipeline position analysis or anything like that. Did you ever incorporate that kind of out-quarter view into your rhythms?
For sure. And so I like to think of this in terms of less month, quarter, year, what have you, more period, right?
Sure.
And the reason for that is there are a lot of companies like Carta, for example, where there is no definition of out-quarter business because their average time to close was 20 days, right? So you can't even do that. At Pave, the deals were still pretty zippy, but they were closer to around 60 days. And so you get a little bit of out-quarter business, but not a lot. And so what we would do is we would always forecast month and quarter. And then towards the back half of the quarter, we would start to spin up the next quarter. So usually at the end of month 2, we would be like, hey, folks, we're going into the end of this quarter. And it's sort of like as we are dropping this plate, we're lifting the other plate of the next quarter in front of us. And that becomes a little bit more of a capacity and mathematical type of forecast versus a deal by deal forecast.
It's so interesting, Armand, that you have this rhythm that becomes repeatable so that you avoid something that happens to a lot of sales teams where they're so focused on the current quarter and on making the quarter that they have no idea how well they're positioned for next quarter. And they're like, that's next quarter's problem. I'm not even going to worry about it. So they work their tails off. They're exhausted by the end of the quarter. And then calendar flips, all the numbers go back to zero. And they have to totally scramble for a couple weeks probably to evaluate the health of the business and then actually get to work. So what you're doing by implementing this rhythm that's programmatic, that's repeatable, is you're avoiding those huge swings, the huge ebbs and flows of understanding. And you're leveling things out so that everything is overlapping nice and usefully so that you always know where you're at, what the likely outcomes are going to be, and what you need to do to course correct or double down or whatever it may be.
And I want to double down on that is you can have a lot of fun with this. I mean, you guys have probably seen this if you ever listen to a show. I'm a rather sarcastic person. And so you weave in those moments where you teach your team those things into your rhythms. So anyone on my team that you talk to will tell you, on the 15th of the month, they'll finish my sentence right now, right? I say, it's the 15th of the month. You know what that means? And they're like, it means if your deals aren't in red lines, then it's probably not a commit, right? And they're like, okay, great. It's the week of the 22nd, right? What does that mean for the SDR team? That means it's technically the last week of the month for the SDR team. And what does that mean for the AE team? That means 90% of your time should be focused on next month. 10% of your time is holding your deals to their word right now. And so you reinforce that forward-looking mentality, which is my job as a VP of sales to go and make sure that I'm telling the CEO and the board that I can see the future. It's my job to cascade that down to my reps and teach them to have that same mentality and accountability too.
Amazing. Amazing. This cascading of accountability is super important. You've mentioned the collaboration that's so helpful in making sure that not only sellers are working together, but the cross-functional stakeholders are involved at the right times. You've mentioned the governance of the standardization of different processes to make sure that you can show up as predictable. You can quote unquote see the future. Love that. See around corners every now and again. And that combination of collab and gov, that combination of art and science is what the best sales leaders are really doing these days. So they know they got their process on lockdown. They know all the metrics, the key data points that matter. And they know that this is still a human business. This is still people selling to people. We need to create space for people to be themselves and to work deals the way that fits their own individual personality. So it sounds like you're checking all the boxes.
We're trying. We didn't check every single box, but I think the number one thing is that there was a degree of intensity, pacing, and just velocity that would occur in the early stages of selling. And the number one thing that you can do as a sales leader is, one, you can be radically transparent around the conversations that you have to have with your board and with your CEO and with the sales managers. So you show that you're eating your own dog food. And then two, as you cascade those rhythms down there, I mean, Kyle, I would get in there and I would cold call with my reps and make it a really fun time. And if I got a meeting before someone, I would dunk on them. And if they got a meeting before me, oh man, the team would rip into me. And so that's how you keep things fresh, is you take all these corporate pleasantries out of the equation and you just show them like, hey folks, your job is a microcosm of my job. We're all in this thing together. So let's have a good time doing it.
Amazing. Amazing, Armand. Thank you so much. One last question for you. I like to ask all of our guests, if you had to recommend a book to a sales leader, maybe even if it's on the topic of how to think about revenue rhythms, you get bonus points for that. Doesn't have to be. But what would be the book that you'd recommend to sales leaders and why?
I'll give you two. So they're not sales books, unfortunately, but I think that's okay, because the reality is in sales leadership, there's actually a deficit of good sales leadership content out there, which is why I'm so glad that you're doing this stuff, is there's not a lot of really, really good written sales leadership advice. The two things that have really helped me, number one is I have a background in strategy and consulting, and the number one, not necessarily book, but an e-guide that I'll send out to you is a guide on issue trees written by someone who used to work at McKinsey. And so issue trees are just the concept of breaking every single problem into threes. I can break a sales cycle into prospecting, discovery, and process. I can break prospecting down into cold call, cold email, and how to manage your day. I can make a cold call into openers, value props, and objections. And having that degree of clarity and ability to break things down and segment things for your team will give you, one, the credibility with your team that you're able to build out a curricula for them. And then two, it will also tell you the different anchor points in your sales cycle where you can install rhythms, right? So those prospecting, discovery, and process. So being a structured thinker is critical if you want to be an extremely good coach. If you just want to be a Michael Jordan and YOLO it and fly by the seat of your pants and be a natural athlete, you don't have to think about how to break down problems, but the number one skill you can learn is how to break down problems. And then number two, there's a book called High Output Management that talks a lot about rhythms as well and how to install rhythms to inspect and make sure things are going well without doing what's called managerial meddling, which is unnecessarily poking into people's business. That's why you have rhythms, is so that you don't have to do that because you do it a little bit here and there at multiple points in the week.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. These are new recommendations to me and to the podcast, so super valuable to our listeners. Armand, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. Anything else you want to plug? Where can people find you?
The number one episode that I would recommend everyone listen to on 30 Minutes to President's Club is episode number 5 with Kyle Coleman. That's all I'll say. You can find me on LinkedIn, but it's been an absolute pleasure, man. And I love what you guys are doing here. I'm a big fan of Claria as well. Also been a customer in the past. So if I can ever be helpful to anyone, just DM me on LinkedIn. Try to get back to as many as I can. Cheers.
You're a good man, providing a ton of value to the whole community. Thank you for everything, Armand. And that is a wrap for this episode of the Run Revenue Show. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Don't let what you heard today go to waste. Take 2 minutes to download today's checklist to get your priorities in line for the week. You can find that linked in our show notes. And if you liked what you heard, make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. We'll be back next Monday with more to help you win your week.